Have you ever been in a class and was learning about a science or reading and it wasn't very engaging? There was no connection to real life. I think this happens to a lot of us. The lesson that I chose to do for the interdisciplinary lesson plan had to do with science in regards to the plant life cycle. The central idea of this was for students to understand the environmental education and ecological literacy through garden-based learning. There would be increased knowledge of the scientific method, plants, fertilizer, and then an awareness of behavioral changes, and it also facilitates higher order thinking. The first thing that we'll talk about is what I used for the pre-reading strategy. There were a lot of language demands for this particular lesson, a lot of words that the student needed to learn. So it's important to sort of engage the student with a pre-assessment activity. And the one that I chose was using a content pass. A content pass is an engaging way for students to construct knowledge prior to the start of a lesson. It sort of alleviates a lot of the stress for the lesson. They get to become familiar with the terminology, the academic language of the unit, and get to see a visual image of what they're going to learn, which is important for some of the English language learners that I talked about a lot in my lesson plan. So for the content pass, each table group, I use a lot of table groups in my lesson that are strategically placed based on academic level and how well they work with one another. So for this particular activity, they each get a book at their table group and they fill out a worksheet all together. They take turns for each book, so each member of the group participates in the writing. This is a great way for the teacher to sort of walk around and answer any questions that they might have, and you get to see where they might be a little bit challenged or could struggle with the material. So each group would become familiar with either the article that I used or a few of the books, and they would go through it and come up with a fact, and then they would also come up with a question. And then as a group, we would come to the rug and we would discuss all of the facts and the questions that we had, and sometimes a lot of the questions they come up with are ones that other table groups had as well. So these can be easily addressed to the whole group. The second item is we used for this lesson was Mrs. Spitzer's Garden. This is a really great book to connect to the real life. They get to see that a plant is sort of like them. It needs a lot of education and nutrients, and there's a lot of things that help us survive, just like plants, so they can easily connect these two, and that's why I used this book. It also was based off of my own kindergarten class and my kindergarten teacher. So it's sort of a fun way to connect my life to the education that I'm teaching them for that particular lesson. The next thing that I would like to talk about is the assessment activity. This would be just walking around, like I said, giving students the confidence to ask questions and that they're aware, and there's a lot of feedback going on while they're working on the life cycle book, which is the next. The life cycle book would be during reading strategy, so they would work on a life cycle alphabet book. This serves as a summative assessment because each page demonstrates the understanding that the student has learned throughout the lesson. So they would be writing a word that corresponds to the lesson on each page that also goes with a letter. So they're working on their sounds and they're also recognizing the science terminology that we have gone over. There's a lot of academic language in demand, and these alphabet books help a lot with this. I also talked about using a lima bean worksheet before we planted our table group gardens. We would use microscopes and they would fill out this lima bean worksheet, and this sort of serves as an assessment of their academic language because they are demonstrating that they have an understanding of the language that's being used by properly using them on the page and correctly demonstrating the word And this also allows for them to demonstrate the knowledge that they have learned throughout the lesson. So we talked about the pre-reading. The key questions for this is what's in a seed, what are the important factors for the plant life cycle, and these will all be addressed during the pre-reading assessment. So for the vocabulary activity, we would read the book I spoke about, Mrs. Spitzer's Garden, and as we go through the book, I would pause and talk about the different terminology. This sort of builds vocabulary. I would also discuss certain words that might be confusing that we might touch upon, and these would all help with vocabulary. There would be a lot of visual aids as well. I think this helps, especially in younger grades like third grade, which is what this one would be used. So during the lesson, we talked about the alphabet books and the Lima Bean worksheet, and the Lima Bean microscope activity would be the main body of the lesson, and then they would be using the gardening tool, which isn't reading related, but that's where the science comes in. They get to be hands-on with the material, which is been more beneficial than I think just listening to information, retaining it, and then writing on a worksheet. I think getting their hands on the activity that you're doing is much more important. During the reading strategy is the ABC book, and they would have time to discuss with their tables and go over different examples of what to use. After the reading strategy, so after the alphabet book has been created, the student will go in their science journal that we have throughout the year, and they would write a reflection on the lesson for that day. So they would talk about going through each of the books, listening to Mrs. Spitzer's Garden, examining the lima beans through the microscope, and planting their own garden, and then writing their ABC books, just discussing thoughts independently, questions they might have had, hypothesizing what the lima bean is going to look like, how long it's going to take, how they felt throughout the lesson that day. And this sort of creates higher order thinking, which I think is important for a post-reading activity. I think to sort of summarize in their own minds and reflect on what they learned is a great way to go over the content, and they have a much better opportunity at remembering the material. So there would be no homework or anything that would go home with them. This is strictly an in-class lesson. I think that sometimes homework can be a little bit overwhelming, but throughout the upcoming weeks, based off of this lesson, we would be doing a lot of writing and describing what's going on with our table plants. Utilizing a garden-based learning style is really important, and I attached the article that I read that showed how important this can be in a science lesson. So the assessment tools that I would use would be collecting that lima bean worksheet, collecting the alphabet book, and not grading it based off of creativity, but more a completion grade to see that they were engaged and they tried to connect each letter to something that we were learning. And then also going through the journals and seeing how they felt through these. These would all be assessments that I would use. And then I would also be walking around and checking to see if they're engaged, making sure that they're discussing things with their table, they're asking questions, they're understanding the material, and I would look at their papers as they're going, answer any questions. I would definitely go one-on-one with some of the students that might be struggling and be aware of what they're struggling. Other students might have some similarities with what's hard for them, and maybe I would address this in future lessons. And the connection with the lesson I talked about was kind of the garden-based learning sort of connects hands-on activities with what's actually happening. The plants are growing. We're learning about the life cycle. So they're connecting it to themselves with Mrs. Spitzer's garden, and then they're also using the gardens to see the real life connection in real life with flowers and plants, and they get this background knowledge of how these things develop and grow and everything that they need to grow. So this is my lesson, and I really think that I would use this in my third grade classroom.